So, are there any reactions to what we saw before the break? We'd like to hear some of your
Check, 1, 2. Perfetto. Um, as you maybe remember, I've seen your film yesterday too, and I've seen some, not so much in the stylistic department, but the narrative style, let's put it that way. I see some similarities in those two films, and as I understood, you don't really appreciate the terminology genre. But would you say that your style, your narrative style, is the reduction of information and not the reduction of facts and information in favor of producing and showing emotions and the reality as it is, to transport feelings more than facts and information? Because yeah, and concepts, exactly, because normally if you think of documentation, it's like, I don't know, there's a heroin addict, and they tell you when the house was built, and how he got into addiction, and etc., etc. So there are facts and information. Would you say maybe that your style in the narrative aspect is creating a feeling and transmitting feelings and emotions more than information, which, if I may add, um, would make me understand the connection between music and film, because whilst information arrives at an intellectual level, the feeling and the emotions, as you showed before, would arrive directly here, you know. And I was wondering if that is your style, and if so, if this was an intellectual choice or if it happened experimenting. That's it.
Yeah. Um, I think it's fair to say yes to what you said. Um, and it uh, it just happened. It just evolved that way. But I also, as I grow older, have intellectual reasons why I think that's a good thing to do. You know, because I think ultimately it's a provocation to, let's say, in a general sense, to see more deeply, to see via associative thinking, as opposed to simply being told facts. You know, so what it's doing is encouraging both the senses and the mind to experience things in what I would call a different or deeper way of perceiving reality. And I mean, we were talking about outside that you know how far in this direction can you go before you entirely lose your audience. And I, aside from one film, and maybe aside from Césaire, where I was in school just doing what I thought made sense to me, um, I've always been making films for audiences. And then you come into this sort of world of, well, how do you balance the the formal things that we're all accustomed to, that are all part of our language, part of our way of reading film? How do you balance that with this other kind of, let's call it a dimension? A dimension. How do you how do you balance that language with this more abstract, emotional, psychological way of seeing something without entirely losing your viewer. So, I mean, I've been, you know, walking that fine line for decades now, trying to find the sweet spot, sometimes going more in one direction, sometimes going more in the other direction.
Are there any questions? Other questions?
I was wondering, well, maybe you could comment on that also later once we're going to watch maybe something a bit more recent of yours. But I was wondering, maybe even in your earlier years when you were starting to experiment with cinema, did you choose the Crusaders for the making of the film? So the people, I don't know, for example, the sound designer with you, were you choosing the musicians to work with specifically, or was more rather organic and rather, I saw that person, I'd rather work with him?
Yeah, no, everything is a choice because you feel a connection or a potential for an interaction that will give something. I mean, a lot of it is intuitive, but you know, if I work with a certain musician, maybe it's because that music touched me, or if I work with a philosopher, it's because that philosophy touched me. But that said, I do a lot of, you called me Capitan this morning, because I really have my hands in everything. You know, I'm doing sound design, I'm doing camera, I'm producing, I'm really, you know, trying to guide this often mysterious process around a set of ideas. And if I bring in a collaborator, I do give them their realm, but ultimately I will still end up, you know, making the final decision of how something fits in the big piece, big puzzle. Yeah.
Any other? Yeah.
Yeah, I want to just add that it's really important the way that Peter is making his films, because he's trying to let us know that we, the audience, are the one that have to construct the meaning of the film. You know, not just being the passive watcher who is just waiting that the meaning will be coming from the screen, but we have to construct the meaning of those images. So that's why it's really important, the work that he's doing.
This is more a personal question, and watching these movies today and also LSD gods and gambling, I had an impression that there is a way of exercise the attraction for some of the characters' attitude and features. I don't know if I've made myself clear. It's like, you know, these people staying at the edge of society or at the edge of mental health. They attract and provoke fear as well in us, in brackets, normal people, you know. And I also felt that for you, it's a big work to stay objective and to stay behind the camera, in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true. I'm attracted to things and people that create rupture, that evoke a different way of looking at something. It's just like, and this is part of my own upbringing, because I was born in Canada to European parents, to Swiss parents, and very early I was being shifted between cultures, and this continued now for my whole life. And there's these radical perspective shifts where, you know, I would then carry it on and go to India, but I would learn so much about my own home because I was in India. And so that kind of attraction to perspective shift to rupture has been there throughout. And what was the second part of what you said?
It must be, I mean, in my opinion, difficult to not get infected by this view and to keep
Right.
a personal, how to say, way of viewing, or is the other way around, maybe?
Yeah. I mean, when I finished Gambling, Gods, and LSD, which was a huge experience that lasted, 10 years of my life and 5 years of shooting and editing, I remember people asking me that same question, like, how did you not get affected or pulled into, you didn't become a Christian, you didn't become a follower of Amma, you didn't start doing heroin, you didn't, how did you do that? Like, how did you not get pulled in? And I thought, oh, well, it was easy because I'm making a film, because the film protects me in a way because I'm in the domain of this creation and interfacing with the world through it. And funnily enough, when the film was finished and I wasn't making a film anymore, and I encountered some similar things, it was much more difficult not to get pulled in somehow. So interestingly, the entire process of filmmaking was kind of the buffer.
Any other questions? Then I think
you said that your position come from the fact that you are a son of immigrants, and Cesare is also the time when you met Atomegoyan, who was a son of immigrants too. He's from an Armenian family who moved to Canada, and your collaboration starts also on this base of immigrant. I mean, not openly, but you felt to share something because of your situation of your family origin.
I mean, I think one of the characteristics of the Canadian film scene, especially in the 80s, was that so many of us were, we were the children of recently immigrated people to Canada, and that's part of what defined the culture in Toronto. All these new arrivals, and that probably gave some certain kind of way of looking at ourselves. I mean, I would say the films that Adam make and the films that I make are very different, but we did have an ability to, like I mentioned before, have a kind of perspective that was implicated in the filmmaking. But it's certainly not what made, at least consciously, Adam and I connect. Like we never talked about that. Adam saw César in the end of the year film school presentation, and he went to a different university, and someone suggested that he go to these screenings and maybe talk to me, because he was looking for a cameraman for his first film when he got out of school. And so he saw that, connected to that. He showed me his work. We became friends, and that's that.
In a way, you influenced his work, because I mean, César, one of the three protagonists, is an entomologist, and when you made the camera for Atom in Next of Kin and most of all Black Comedy, you work as an entomologist. You film the family as an entomologist.
Yeah, I never thought of that. Yeah, I mean, it was interesting meeting Adam because his school was not a film school. It was a university. He was studying communications, but there was a film department, and he was an example of, you know, someone who was coming out of theater and ideas and characters, and you know, his initial attraction to film was really a filming of the theater, but his ideas were very complex and advanced and sensitive, but his cinematic kind of language was still in the very early days, and I think for me it was the reverse. I was like deep into the language of cinema, the potential of portraying these different states of perception, and we merged in a good way because for him it was a learning experience for me to do camera and to be talking about how to actually shoot something, like what is the personality of the camera even when it films an actor, like what does it mean to be looking at this actor from this perspective. And I was learning from him a lot, mostly about characters and script development and interaction between people.
So maybe because we already entered into collaborations, and we're talking about the atom, maybe we could show Beckett, maybe we could show Krabs tape, so it's an example how to shoot theater play. No, it's also how to shoot how to shoot how to shoot an actor on the stage, actually.
Yeah.
Made from the text made out of theater play.
Yeah.
One take.
Yeah, the trouble is, maybe I should tell the story about
Yes,
Crap's Last
tell.
Tape. Because Crap's Last Tape by Samuel Beckett, they were doing a series of Beckett on film, and they asked Adam to do Crap's Last Tape, which is a very interesting story of the character Crap listening to old reel-to-reel tape recordings. And as he's listening to these things, he's revisiting his past and going through a kind of emotional, not really a breakdown, but an emotional journey. And Adam asked me to film that, to do the camera, because it's as though the tape that's on the table has its own consciousness that's affecting the character, which was played by John Hurt, who's an amazing actor. And we thought that, okay, if I do the camera, that we would do very long shots. This is why I'm explaining it instead of showing it, because you have to watch the whole thing in a way to get it.
I would like to watch. I would watch it afterwards again and again.
So there's a shot in the film that's about 30 minutes long, and the film is, I think, 50 minutes. And you see John Hurt sitting at a table. He's listening to the tape, and the camera starts fairly far back, and it's a big Panasonic 35 millimeter camera. So for those of you who know the technology, that means that the roll of film is like this big, and it's very, very heavy. And so you balance the camera at the beginning, and all the film is at the front of the camera, and slowly during the shot, that whole weight moves to the back of the camera. So I'm telling you this for a reason. So we start this shot where John is listening to his tapes, and the idea is that me operating the camera is kind of like his memory, or kind of having an evocation that's similar to what the audio is giving to the character. And we had it set up that I could give hand signals to the person pushing the dolly when I felt it was right to move in or up or down. And so this is for 30 minutes. and this incredible actor is relating this incredible text, and you have the whole film crew and my little finger guiding the camera in and around, and it becomes incredibly emotional. What John Hurt is doing, and you see him. I see him, inside the camera in this little window for 30 minutes, and as the film is moving from the front to the back of the camera, the weight of the camera starts to be really creating a huge tension in my body, just to keep it from shaking or from moving. And he's starting to cry. John Hurt's starting to cry, and I'm like this, and then I start to cry. And I'm like, filming this thing, and I have tears in my eyes, and it was just like transported into another dimension. And then finally the shot was over, and I was like, what do I do now? Because I was I was kind of a wreck, and I came away from the camera, and I saw that the entire crew was in the same state from this incredible concentration on this amazing performance. And we just took a break. Everybody went, and that was that. I mean, we filmed it one take, and that was it. Yeah.
So let's stay in the theater and show a piece of tectonic plates, which is also again the play that made of Robert Lepage, also your friend. And so tell us, how did you combine shooting a theater play and then combined it with a film? And let's talk a little bit about how to script a theater play for the film. This is the basic question.
Yeah. So I mean, there's two things happening with tectonic plates. It's a kind of collaboration, but it's a very deep collaboration in the sense that it's all the actors and Robert and myself worked for a year on developing what the stage play would be, primarily for them, and for me in parallel developing, well, how would I turn that into a film? And they work in a way that I could really relate to, that had already been something I'd been doing in my own way, but was very kind of tangible. They worked using metaphor. So they took the idea of tectonic plates as a beginning. What do tectonic plates mean? And what are stories that could be derived from the metaphor of tectonic plates? So within a year, the actors would go off in small groups. They would develop characters. They would research. They would actually do research like we do in documentary film, and find stories that would relate to the metaphor. So, for example, Eugene Delacroix and Georges Sand became characters, and Frédéric Chopin as well. And there was a painting. There was a painting by Delacroix that was cut in two, with Georges Sand and Frédéric Chopin being sold in different countries again and again. And so that was one story of this painting that was traveling around the world in two parts, like tectonic plates. And we ended up filming in Venice because of connections to that. We ended up finding stories to do with Jim Morrison in Paris. I mean, it's a labyrinth of associations that also explore sexuality, of a man becoming a woman. And that was kind of the fabric of the content of the play. And then it went another step further when I was asked, this was like a commission to make a film of this, where you have the two forms of theater and film. And my challenge was, well, how do I merge these two forms? Especially when when Robert, one of the things that he does brilliantly and is very well known for, is he takes cinematic devices and puts them into theater. So when you're in a theatrical space, it's magical to see how he does certain transitions, borrowing from film. But if I just film what he did, it's boring, because in a film we know that language. So I had to find a way to merge theater and film. And I mean, I'll show you the introduction of the piece, and you can get a sense of it.
The first idea, what was to prepare the display in two different medias, or it was that you like to introduce also the film medium, because the theater couldn't address some issues or maybe some ideas, because the theater is having right now, the film has this this possibility to manage time, to play with time.
I mean, one of the things that I particularly noticed is the theater piece was constantly evolving. They would once they were ready, they would show it in Scotland in a particular version, which was much longer than the film. It was almost 3 hours. And then the next time they showed it in Montreal, they would have edited it differently. And it was kind of like live editing, which was also interesting as a filmmaker to watch these different incarnations of the theater. But of course, the film, once the film is finished, that's the film. And that was kind of challenging to have to lock it in to something. But the project was proposed by producers, in fact. Michael Morris, who's a well-known producer in England, it was his concept, the tectonic plates, and he proposed it to Robert. And at the same time, a film producer who I had worked with, Neve Fishman, proposed that I would make a film out of it, which was actually made for television, for British and Canadian television. So it was very creative, two very creative producers, pooling what they perceived to be interesting work together. Yeah.
So maybe we can show a little bit of picture of life. Yes. We don't want to forget, because if we have time. So this is kind of example of if you're going to show the opening, as I asked you before. This was the film that really has incorporated your poetic. Really, how do you feel about a film, and how do you perceive the world, really? So, can you tell us a little bit how it happened that night in Zurich many years ago? And
Yeah, I mean, it's actually interesting for me to be jumping through these films so quickly now, seeing new relationships to each other, because I had just finished Tectonic Plates, and I was in Switzerland showing work there, and someone invited me to a dinner with mutual friends, and at this dinner was this man named Andreas Zust. And he was a strange character. He's sort of half artist, half scientist, very odd, very big, and clever, and an art collector. And he says to me, after 2 hours of meeting him, he says, "So, you want to make a film about the Northern Lights?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure. That's a good subject. If yeah, I would make a film about the Northern Lights. If you can find the money, I'll make the film. And he says, okay. So I didn't think anything would become of it, but sure enough, 2 months later, I'm back in Canada, and we talk on the phone, and he says, okay, I have the money for us to go on an expedition to Churchill, Manitoba, which is one of the best places in the world to see the Northern Lights. It's very far north in Canada. And that kind of began our friendship, and also was a film that was very significant for me in this kind of quasi-documentary world, because Andreas's proposition was, well, just make a film, as long as the Northern Lights are in it, whatever, maybe it'll be a half-hour film for TV, maybe it'll just be shots of the Northern Lights, maybe just do it, And of course, that's what a gift for someone to offer that, and that's because he was both an artist and a scientist, and he worked like that. He believed in creativity. He believed in things finding their way, and so we went on this journey to this crazy place, which you'll see, and I began collecting images, sounds, words around the experience of going to film the Northern Lights, and it gradually evolved into the film that it is, and I can talk about how it evolved maybe after we look at the beginning. So what I'm going to show you is the first 15 minutes of the film, which kind of gives you a lot of different facets of that film, but also of my filmmaking as it continued into the future after that.
Okay, thank you. So, do you have any questions, thoughts, reflection? Okay, so how to film unfilmable, and how to film clouds, how to film those spirits in this era when we are always taking pictures, filming. Just a thought on that.
Well, to continue the story of what I introduced, we basically went to the north to capture these images without really knowing how to do it, as you may be able to tell. And it required, doing single frame exposures of the lights in order for them to expose the film at all in the first place, and then work with that material to give an impression of what the lights were like. But what happened to me when I was up there was, standing in this minus 30 degree lunar landscape with this incredible natural phenomena, I realized how profoundly different the experience of actually being there is from the experience that you would get in a movie theater. Not that movie theaters are so bad. I mean, they're good experiences too. But it began this whole kind of thinking process of, well, how do we see the world these days? How much of what we see is informed by images that we've seen, by the different media that we encounter daily? Sort of becoming very aware that our consciousness is made up of all these different influences, which are actually not connected with the real world. And thus the film became an essay about that, about mediated experiences, such as the very film that you're watching about the Northern Lights. So in the end, the film became a kind of parallel journey, one of the very simple story of this bumbling film crew that's trying to get the Northern Lights on film, and another a kind of philosophizing around, the ideas of mediated experience.
But the light is also the thing that allows the film image to be, because without the light you can, and I found it really interesting how at the beginning, when there is more and more light in one shot, till the point that the image vanish. So did you reflect also a little bit about the medium, about the nature of the film image?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's actually why the title is Picture of Light. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe let's. You have one more.
That's maybe some other will ask something, but okay, you had rehearsals, kind of rehearsals for technical, point of view of the expedition, because it was really probably completely new experience for you also to shoot in that kind of environment, because I don't know the film stock, how it it is possible it become rigid, or it's completely different way of you have to do it in the other way. The film cameras, do they operate in that kind of temperatures and so on? So you had probably had a lot of problems also during the shooting.
Yeah, you have to prepare, obviously, and you take the regular oil out of the film camera and you replace it with something that won't freeze. Yeah, and we also had to. It was absurd. We had to heat the camera because it was out all night, and we had car battery warmers wrapped around the camera. But trial and error. One of the problems was that it overheated, and it actually melted the inside of the camera. And additionally, the camera didn't function properly. When you see the whole film, you'll see that there's sections of the Northern Lights where the stars have tails on them, and that's because the mechanism of the frame being pulled through the camera, the shutter wasn't closing, so it was exposing every time it pulled down. It made a line, which is in a way quite beautiful. It's a mistake, but it's an aberration. But the really good thing was that I had a very good insurance policy, because I was warned about filming in those conditions, and other filmmakers said, whatever you do, get a really good insurance policy. So I got one from Hollywood, and sure enough, we had this problem with the shutter, and they gave us enough money to go back a second time. And this actually became something also that influenced how I worked down the line, because what had happened was we went on the first trip. It was exploratory. I filmed a bunch of things. We started editing, and then I was learning what the film would be about in that process. So I had on the editing table the pieces, and I then knew a year later, oh, okay, now I want to get XYZ to fit into ABC, and insurance paid for it. And I went a second time, and we worked the new material into the old, and then proceeded with the bigger edit.
Did you insure it also for the time if you wouldn't catch the aurora borealis? Because it's not obvious that you will get it in the sky.
No, that was a you can't insure that. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, how much did those difficulties, technical difficulties, influence the way you perceived all the surrounding and later on, in fact, picture it?
Yeah, very much. It really, you're moving about 3 or 4 times slower than normal filmmaking. every time you go outside, it takes an hour to 2 hours just to prepare to go outside. It's kind of like filming on the moon, I guess. You have all this paraphernalia, and you've got to get all the equipment working. And every time you go inside, you have the same problem. You can't just bring a camera inside because it gets covered in ice. So, I mean, what that all did was make you very aware of the elements that you were dealing with. Not only light exposing film, but this narrow threshold that we live in where it's comfortable to live, because there you can't really live outside. And at this time of year anyway. And of course the whole culture then is influenced by the natural circumstances, that the fact that they built a port here and that there's houses, but in the dead of winter everybody's inside watching TV and getting really drunk, and all these things influenced the content of the film, but also the feeling, the relationship to the natural world.
I was wondering, I was expecting actually the beautiful colors of the aurora borealis, and you have decided to take black and white pictures only. Is that a technical or artistic decision?
No, you have to watch the whole film. This is just the introduction. So the way that we were able to understand the intensity of the light was by taking the black and white photographs. That told us, well, if you expose the film for 5 minutes or 5 seconds, you get this kind of exposure, because no light meter that we had could actually register how bright they were. So it was kind of a subjective trial and error. But as the film progresses, you will see the lights with the different colors and movements. Yeah. I think it was not 400 ASA, and we had the second time we went with 35 millimeter instead of Super 16, and we had the highest speed lens that we could get. And then we were exposing on average 5 seconds per frame.
I want to ask about your relationship with nature, with environment, because I think you grew up in Toronto, in a city, but nature is one of the main issues of your cinema, and it's not becoming, because it's already, but it's more and more important going on your career. Nature is one of your main interests.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, why? I guess being born in Toronto, we have access to wilderness quite close, and I would say it's even part of our culture in Toronto to go camping, to go canoeing, to really disconnect from the civilized world and go on these camping trips. And that happened to me in various forms very early on, going to friends' cottages or going on camping trips. And I was always amazed by nature, and I was always really aware in the city of wherever you look, there's this human hand that has fabricated something out of nature. And this is really in the early days before there's now a global consciousness around the environment. It was something that I was just intrigued by, how we've constructed the things we construct from the natural elements.
So, can I squeeze one more before the broken land? So, I would like to know what was the difference for you watching Aurora Borealis, like without a camera, watching it through the lenses, and how was it for Andreas watching it all the time without a camera.
Well, there's a line in the film towards the end where I say something like, I resist the urge to get my camera, but to simply watch instead, because they're very different experiences. But I'm, my whole personality is now developed using cinema to engage with the world, to engage with nature. So I can't really escape that. This might work.
So you really need to watch this. Yes. So let's go to the Broken Land. So this is the you again collaborating with two directors as an artistic director and a cinematographer. Can you tell us how did you begin this project? What it's all about in a few sentences? And so this was the light. Non ho capito. No, yes, Peter, just.
Well, this is a type of collaboration which I've done a number of, where I'm basically just invited by other filmmakers to do camera, and by doing camera, because I'm a filmmaker, it ends up being a deeper collaboration than just shooting what I'm told to shoot. And in this case, Stephanie Barbe and Luc Peter are already co-directors, and they had done tons of research around the subject of the film, and invited me to go there and be with them. And it was interesting, I think, for them. It's actually a good formula, because they had done all the research. They knew the work so well. They knew their subject so well. I didn't. And so what they get from me is someone who's responding freshly to the situation, which I think is often a good thing, because you're discovering as things are being presented to you, you haven't overworked it in the preparation. And then another thing we did that was interesting, so we shot it, and they went into editing, and they edited for a long time, like for a year or something. And then they invited me back to the edit. And it was very intense 10 days where we went through what they did. And I said, okay, will you just let me suggest whatever and try it? And because I had the experience of the shooting and knew the material, and had fresh eyes, because one of the very hard things in editing is keeping your eyes fresh. We went through the whole film and jigged a whole bunch of things and changed it, and that became the end result. So it was an interesting formula of collaboration that I think took advantage of objectivity, if you will, or spontaneity. Yeah.
So maybe we should tell what the film is about. It's a documentary about border between Mexico and USA. So about this microcosmos there that is happening near the border, all the maybe I don't know how to explain. The different realities that are really happening there, or the absence of this happening also, because sometimes we perceive something we don't see the actions of the people. So let's watch it, and then we'll